Hi, my name is Gregg. I am a partner at DataMade, and which is a civic tech company here in Chicago. I'm very excited to be with you today to share some work that me and Denali, who will introduce herself in a second, but I'm trying to understand what's going on with CPS enrollment and how it interacts with the budget for the school district. Denali, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Denali Dasgupta. I'm the principal and founder of a human services and public sector measurement company called Higher Ground Data. And I am also a candidate for the 39th Ward Alderman. So make sure you vote on February 28th, especially if you can vote in the 39th Ward. And one of the things that I've been really excited about with this is how we can take administrative data and think about answering questions, not just about policy and finance, but also sort of getting at power and narrative. And so I think this is a really cool presentation for a couple of reasons. We want to talk a little bit about what we did, what we found, and why it matters. But for me, the big takeaway is that there are lots of ways that curious folks can ask really thoughtful and deep questions and take methods that are readily available to you, take data that is out there and put out there by city agencies and government agencies, and answer some really challenging questions about why the world works the way that it does. So that's super exciting for me. And that's kind of my stake in this. I hope that by the end of this presentation, we will have talked at least some of you into continuing this work with us, but more importantly, into taking these approaches and methods and applying them to your own work.
So let's get started.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay, so I pulled some headlines and some reports about a story that we hear every year. So right around August of every year, we start to hear these stories about enrollment declines in Chicago public schools. And we always hear them in this particular way about a loss of students, about declining or sliding enrollment. Sorry, my kids just went thundering behind the computer. And we hear it as some kind of deficit-based narrative. So the idea that I think is put in everyone's head as they're seeing these things is somehow the district is losing students. Somehow it's losing power, it's losing hold, and that this is a reflection of something that's happening under the surface that's maybe a little bit troubling. So next slide. So what could that be? Here are some slides or some headlines from the New York City fiscal crisis in the 1970s. And I think that fiscal crisis is the thing, the beating, pulsating heart underneath the fear here. And so in the 1970s, the city of New York went into a fiscal crisis. And the narrative that emerged was this idea that the tax base was leaving. People with wealth were leaving. The costs of the city were rising. And there was a mismatch between how much things cost, how good they were, and people were fleeing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is kind of a narrative that got fixed in our heads. I'd also like to point out that it is not a true story. And if anyone wants to talk to me about urban and municipal fiscal crises, we can take that offline because I love talking about that. But I think this is the thing that is under the surface, this idea that, oh no, CPS is losing enrollment. The district could be in fiscal crisis. The tax base might be leaving the city. Chicago is, in a fiscal death spiral and on its way to decline. And so I think that's what's underneath. But I also want to acknowledge, next slide, that there is a little bit of truth to the fear and the panic. It's not, based in nothing. And one of the places that it touches what I would consider collective trauma in the space of Chicago, and particularly communities and schools, is that the city of Chicago did shut down a lot of schools. And there is a threat of school closures, even though there's a moratorium right now. The idea that there is loss, the idea that there is scarcity, the very real, tangible, and visible sense for some folks in some communities that schools don't have enough funding for essential services, quality instruction, and supportive environments is real. And so because there are enough pieces of this that are real, and because they fit together in a convenient and emotional narrative, it's really easy to believe that they're tightly coupled, and you can tell a story of sort of boom, 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 boom. And I think that's how we got started looking into this. Next slide. So I guess this was the question that was posed to us. We know that there's some relationship between enrollment and the budget. So that is how many students are in the district and how much money we're getting from different sources to fund and educate those students. And how seriously should we take enrollment as a vital sign of district and city health? And what will happen if enrollment continues to decline? What does it mean for the school district? What does it mean for planning? What does it mean for our students? What does it mean for our city? And should we be getting ready to go out on the bridge and hand out Welcome to Fear City brochures to everybody? So I'm going to kick it back to Forrest to talk about some of the work that he did.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what the enrollment declines in CPS actually looks like and what is driving it. So the top line thing is that there's been tremendous decline in the size of the CPS student body, from a peak in the early 2000s of over 400,000 students K through 12 to just over 300,000 in 2022, and likely falling by another 20,000 over the next 3 years. It's a lot. I mean, it's about it's almost been a quarter off of our peak, and and it's going to continue. This is largely driven by enormous decline in among African American students, and then also the passing of a baby boom of Latino students, who together make up the vast majority of the student body. This in turn is primarily driven by very steep declines in births. This is the number of births per year for these demographic groups, and the number, if you have fewer children born, then in 1 year, you're gonna have many fewer kindergartners 5 years later. This is just the same points in a different way, is that like each of these lines is a cohort. So this is the students that entered who entered kindergarten in 2012, and then the size of that cohort as they moved through the grades. And there is substantial, we do lose a lot of students from when they first enter in kindergarten, until their cohort graduates. Some of this is families moving from Chicago, some of this is people dropping out. But the key point I want to make here is that on a relative basis, there's really not been dramatic changes. Like, we've always lost like a lot of our kids from the time that they enter in kindergarten to the time their cohort exits 12 years. And there's been no substantial changes in that cohort loss. What is changing is that the entering cohort's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Also, what's not happening is we're not losing market share to private schools. I mean, it's basically been stable for the past nearly 20 years. What's driving this overwhelmingly is that there are fewer children being born in Chicago. And there's a lot of reasons that might be, but I just want to kind of really hammer home that this is not that people are moving after birth. This is not that people are in Chicago, but they're going to another school. It is the proximate immediate cause of this is that there are fewer children. And I think it's going to have huge implications for a city beyond just what's happening in CPS. But this is what's driving the decline. There's also, if you look at these graphs, no indication that this falling number of births is nearing a bottom. Things do not seem to be flattening out for African American birth, and things do not seem to be flattening out for Hispanic births. Well, it's harder to tell what's going on with other populations. Well, the white births are kind of declining now, but they've been going up and down. But they're not. The vast majority of the current, and also for quite a while longer, of the student body is African American and Hispanic children, and so those are really the demographic groups that, at least for the near term, are going to be driving enrollment. And there is no indication that births will be, that the decline in births are going to be slowing anytime soon. So enrollment decline has been substantial. There is no reason to think that it will not continue to be substantial for at least the next 5 years. And with that kind of like, with that foundation, I'll start to see like what that actually could mean for the budget of CPS.
So I think the question now comes to, all the stories are right. Enrollment is declining, but it's not declining because people are leaving. It's not a response to the quality of the schools. But now coming back around as a vital sign, do we think that the ongoing declining number of students in the schools means that we will have less money to run our school district with? Critically, less money per student, and then also less money to fund a system at the size that it is. So one of the things, I've gotten really good at hearing some of the harbingers of crisis narrative. And if you hear someone say the term right size, walk out the back door and just start running, because you know that they have, they've got their knives out. There's a plan there. And so we wanted to understand, if this decline in enrollment continues, what's going to happen to the budget. Next slide. And so I did 2 rounds of coding of the budget. So I downloaded the budget book and I went line by line, and I have a spreadsheet, but I'm not really great at showing it. I can figure out how to do screen share. But essentially, we looked for a couple of things. In round 1, we wanted to just understand this concept of enrollment dependence. So line by line, I went through and I, full disclosure, have a graduate degree in urban planning that includes a pretty substantial background in municipal public finance. And I figured out, does this depend on whether we have a certain number of students enrolled or not? And I put the criteria here on this slide. Any funding formula that has a number of students as an input, any funding formula that uses what I call proportional allocation, meaning that we've got 5 different potential budget units, and the largest one gets the largest share and the second largest gets the second largest share. And that could be of the entire population or of a specific subpopulation. And then finally, any funding stream that is designed to serve or supplement a specific high need or focal population. And part of that, because one of the largest this is the part where I let you know that I have 3 children, and they are 17, 5, and 1. And just like we can go offline and we can talk about municipal public finance and crisis narratives, we can also talk about my life choices. But the other piece is that there are certain subpopulations of students that money is proportionally allocated to. The most notable one being federal Title I money, which is there to supplement schools that have allowed to serve a lot of low-income students. So when we just did this enrollment dependent versus not enrollment dependent, we created this lovely waffle chart. Forrest, I think you helped me. This might be the first thing I ever created in Observable with substantial help from you. And we found out that almost half of the revenue coming into Chicago public schools is completely unrelated to how many students come in the door. And that's because it's largely dependent on local property taxes. And so the idea that if the student population in the city is declining, but the tax base is not decreasing, and the way that Forrest explained how the population shifts are happening doesn't lead us to see that the tax base is declining, nor does looking at taxes over time suggest that that's happening, although I think we could kick that to next week's speaker to really know where that's going. We're not in any danger of collapse. Next slide.
Actually, I would just foot up that point. Like, the population of Chicago over the past 10 years has been stable or increased slightly, depending upon your estimates. And that is during it, and like that increase is in the face of like a horrific loss of our African American population. And what supplanted it is new people moving to Chicago, and who are much wealthier than the average Chicagoan. So like from a kind of tax harvesting perspective, Chicago is better off from its tax base now than it was 10 years ago.
You also see, anecdotally, and this is some migration work that I've done a long time ago with cities and suburbs, the largest exodus of people from a city typically stay within the region. And the single demographic group that's typically most represented is 5-year-olds. Now, they don't just pick up and leave on their own, and that's not always a school district story, but it is a story about family expansion and a really typical pattern of how people cycle in between cities in the region. So for the second round of coding, we saw that about half of the revenue coming into the district is not enrollment dependent, but about half of it is. So what I wanted to know then is that going to be compromised by the continued decline in students, or is it enrollment responsive in a way that will be, for lack of a better way of saying it, resilient in the face of the types of changes that, Forrest's work showed is coming? And so for me, enrollment responsive programs that are dedicated programs, so they're funding a specific thing for the amount of students. They're sort of like self-sustaining or paying. So like driver's ed or lunchroom funds. It's okay for us to just pay for the number of kids who are eating. We need not kind of keep that larger amount of money. So it's kind of like a reimbursement style program. And the next one, there are direct reimbursements, particularly from the state. And then the last piece is really interesting because the bulk of the enrollment dependent funds, particularly the ones that come down from the state, that state formula, what they call student-based budgeting, although that is a whole other thing, is not dependent on the raw number of students, but on the proportional share of students. And because the trends that Forrest is talking about are consistent, not just in the city of Chicago, but the state of Illinois and the nation as a whole, Chicago as a district remains proportionately large in a way that we will still have the largest share of students. And so that says that even though half of the revenue is enrollment dependent, that is not leading us to crisis either. But that being said, that puts us into a different realm of understanding where the fiscal future of our district lies. And so here are a couple of other levers that we found are actually much more significant and things that I'd like to hear more people talking about. So one of them is the idea that if we do have proportional money and we get it and we stay proportionally the largest, understanding how the baseline amount of funding from the state moves is really important to understanding whether we'll have more or less. And so the headline I put here says that Pritzker and for like a large part of the Democrats in the state, they want to continue to increase the amount of money that's being pushed towards education, including early childhood education. A couple of years ago, there was reorganization that brought a lot of preschool into CPS, and that pulled a lot of state money in as well. And so that means, as my dad loves to quote from President George W. Bush, the pie is also getting higher. But at the same time, we spend so much time worrying about declining enrollment as a harbinger of declining revenue that we're not thinking about the larger and more sort of shock-like declines to enrollment that could happen. One of them is that the city has a lot of intergovernmental agreements, and they could start pulling money out of the district through IGAs. And so you see the bottom right-hand corner, there's a headline about cost shifts between the city and the school as the schools move to an elected school board. Another thing that happened is the tier funding from ISB. So there are big chunks of money that we might no longer qualify for. And to Forrest's point, the way the composition of the student body has changed meant that we did not meet a certain low income threshold this year, barely missed it. And that meant that an entire line item of money basically evaporated. The other piece of that, though, that's masking a lot of these things, and we were surprised to see how large it was and how opaque it made everything, was the large influx of COVID crisis money coming in. That really made it hard to look at some of these changes that are happening at the state and federal level and definitively point in a direction, even as we see enrollment has had a consistent direction for about 20 years. So I think my big takeaway from this is that we often spend a lot of time with, and we say this kind of behind the scenes in our research group, with the right vibes, but maybe the wrong story. And it's really important to be able to take, I don't want to call these rigorous methods, but they are methods and they are systematic means of investigation and get a better handle on what's happening so that to the extent that we do feel crisis coming, we understand where it's going to come from. Earlier today, when we were prepping for this, we were talking about things that surprised us. And I don't know if we want to go there yet, or if you want to close this section out first, Forrest.
I think there's just something I would kind of draw out a little bit, which is that, if revenue remains relatively flat, or even if it's decreasing, but it's decreasing at a much lower rate than we're losing our student population, what that could mean is that, I mean, what that absolutely means is that we have more revenue per student than we've ever had before. And what it could mean is that we are providing more resources for the students that we still have left in our district. There has to be a lot of things that have to happen to actually take that first fact and turn it into the second fact, to actually take this opportunity of an incredible opportunity to dramatically increase our per student investment. But it's an opportunity that we face, and it's one of the, and I think that really needs to be a public conversation about how to actualize that opportunity and what to do with that opportunity. I think it will be quite easy if we don't have that conversation for the district and for the city to find ways to not have that translation of revenue to actually investment.
For sure. And I think part two of this project, then, if we discovered that it's not the pressure of the money coming into the district that's creating panic and scarcity and crisis, we wanted to identify where kind of like the locus of freakout is. And it feels like it's somewhere in the district between how the district takes that money and allocates it to schools. And some of this could be laboring under these misapprehensions of this idea that we are just barely clinging to our revenue base. And, you know, I forget what you called me this morning for us, but it was something like generous or nice for saying that it could be misapprehension and it could be panic making people do this, rather than a more cynical or calculated sense of saying, you know, again, the thing that I always fear, let's right size this. Let's think about kind of continuing to dismantle schools, and by extension communities, and by extension sort of the things that kind of hold our young people and our families in place and provide that stability. Because if we gut all of that, then we will reach the point where sort of the vital signs of the city and the health and the well-being of people and the ability of Chicago to be a family-friendly city and a place for everyone to do well will cease to be the case. So I think it does pose a problem where we found out that a lot of things that we maybe believed or were skeptical about, we were right about, but it didn't necessarily make the problem go away. It's a really interesting and uneasy thing to have to sit with.
All right. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the next steps that you think could be that you'd like to investigate, Denali?
Sure. So one of the things that I'm really interested in then is how we're building budgets. And so if folks are not seeing the overall moving pieces and components of building the budget, and they're not starting from either how much money do we have, let's allocate it, or what need do we have, let's build it up, how are we actually making these choices? And for me, it seems constantly like folks are just kind of backing in using last year's numbers and tweaking around the edges. And that's why enrollment becomes so central. And when enrollment and budgets become more tightly coupled, even when enrollment and revenue are not, it leads to some pretty wacky things happening. And so where I would like to go next, sort of for part two, is understanding then when the district is funding schools, because schools have seen really large shocks to their budgets, some of which are enrollment dependent, and some of which are because of larger policy and budgeting things that are happening in the district. How do we ease that pressure valve, knowing that we are not on the brink of imminent fiscal crisis? And how do we take that idea of opportunity that Forrest was talking about and think about how to invest that in our kids, rather than what I've seen in the last couple of years, which is just an increasing sense of fear and scarcity and concern. And because of some structural things with budgets, people will sit with last year's school level budget and this year's school level budget and see some really significant drops. And so thinking about the school funding formula is something that I'm really, really interested in, and applying similar methods of coding and understanding how now all of this general revenue stuff starts to play in a couple of other spaces that include how federal Title I money is distributed, and then a whole other series of things that relate to budgeting, funding allocation, demand for services, and timing and structure of budgets around special education, which is a really, really interesting stream of funds that is not always kind of allocated in a way that aligns with our ideals. So that's where I'm really interested in going next. And I think that there are lots of folks in the parent community and local school councils and in communities in general that are really ready and eager to receive this work. Once we have some more folks kind of thinking about how to process this and get this in people's hands in a way that can activate them and help them advocate for folks in their community.
Here's our contact information, and that's what we got. We delighted to hear your questions.
Awesome. Thank you both. Yes, we have a number of questions. First one from the chat is, do you know if the declining number of children is families having fewer children or fewer families having children at all?
Yes.
I think both are happening. I don't know how much of each of those is a factor for Chicago. Both of those are huge trends. I mean, this trend of demographic decline is happening in Chicago, it's happening in Illinois, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in every rich country, and it's increasingly happening in middle income and lower income countries too. This is something that like, I think it was in the past few years that the United States did not, like, for the first time, did not have enough net immigration and new births to replace its population levels. That might change if we reopen immigration. Obviously, immigration fell sharply under Trump, although there was already declining immigration even before that. But yeah, I mean, this is truly a global trend, and it is in both aspects of families choosing to have fewer children, and then also fewer people getting married, and fewer people having children in it or outside of marriage. All those things are happening.
Want to do the next one, Michael?
Yeah, sure. See another question from the chat here. What has CPS spent per student over the last several years? And is this pretty even across the district, or disproportionately spent on richer neighborhoods?
So I think the way that you calculate a per student spend varies a lot, because what you're looking at is the context of a school that a student is in. And so that's part of the reason that I'm really interested in school funding. There is a stream of money that's called student-based budgeting. That's part of the way that the district funds schools. But it's not what people think, where every kid has kind of like a dollar amount over their heads and it moves with them. There's different kind of tweaks to it depending on the age of the child, depending on some additional demographic factors, and then increasingly other programmatic things are being added into it. And Anthony, who will be speaking in a couple of weeks, just did something that was really simple and really amazing, which is take the student-based budgeting number, the total number, because it is a funding stream in the budget book, and divide it by the number of students, like the enrollment at a school, and see how much those numbers vary. And they vary tremendously, and they don't always vary by the income of the school. And for me, what that's an indicator of is that that is one of three to four largest funding streams that school budget is built out of. And it suggests to me that there's, and so this is kind of like a legal term going into the idea of where we're getting towards equity and adequacy, but that there's supplementation happening, which means that instead of, say, Title I funds going to supplement or add on to what we have a fixed number in mind for a school of how much they should get. And if they're getting more of that through Title I, they may be getting a little bit less of it here and there around the margins. And that's something that I'm really, really worried about from the equity perspective. And I think it's something that no one actually knows.
I have a question about, the leverage points that are possible. So, who makes those decisions about school budgets? And I know it's a few years off, but is the impending elected school board like one of the greatest opportunities, or are there opportunities sooner than when that comes into being?
So, I mean, ultimately and finally, the school board makes the decisions about how sets the policies for how money is going to get allocated to schools. I mean, more approximately the budget office and the central office and the, you know, the CEO and his and their team like have a tremendous control of the policy agenda. But these are all, I mean, these are all policy-based measures. So changing those policies is definitely an enormous leverage point. I think that the elected school board is an incredible point of leverage, but I also think that the hybrid, I think the period where we're going to have a hybrid school board is going to be maybe an even kind of more a time where even more could change, because I think, you know, depending on who the mayor is, they still will have lots of ability to shape how the appointed members view policy. And I think to a certain extent, this is just my personal opinion, I think once we're all used to an elected school board, there's going to be a lot. It's going to actually make the district more conservative for larger changes, which I think is kind of what which is kind of what you want democratic institutions to be, you know. But we're going to go from a point where it's this kind of authoritarian to a point where it's relatively democratic, and I think that transition is going to be a time of opportunity.
I think one thing that will be key in the transition, and something that I started to indicate with some of those headlines, is making sure that as the schools and the city uncouple, that the city doesn't take every opportunity to kind of rob and raid the district, with the understanding that they can pull a bunch of money. It can't be a yours and mine thing. The schools and the city have to operate together in a cooperative way, in a respectful way, right? Because ultimately, the extent to which the schools are a vital sign of health in the city is this a place that you want to be? Is this a place you want to entrust your kids to? Is this a place you want to raise your family and stick around for a long time and create stability in your communities? And I think sometimes that can get a little bit lost when we're thinking about balancing budgets and revenue generation, and everybody is just a little bit on the edge of their seats about where money for things is going to come from.
I would add another thing, which is that I think that it is the case that there are many schools where the enrollment trends are such that they can no longer continue to operate as they have operated because their student body is so small. And I think that to the extent that community organizations, community groups, unions develop alternative visions for operating a school district and operating schools that aren't just shutting those schools down, but are about like finding creative and alternative models, then I think that's one of the highest leverage things that they can do right now. Because I think the thing is that if they don't, then I think it's very likely that the school district, that certain forces in the city will be like, well, the school's too small, it's time to close it. And because there's no other organized vision about what's possible, then that will be what will happen.
And that to me is where the crisis narrative becomes an issue, right? This is the idea of like organized abandonment. This is the idea of, strategic disinvestment. And this is what did happen in the wake of fiscal crises or perceived fiscal crises. And so I think it's important to not, I think the thing that I hear the most when I talk to people who want to think about how many schools we should have and where they should be and how big they are is the idea that it's all tied up in capital planning. And for that, I would just kind of say what I always say, which is like a house is not a home. We can't just like school is more than a building. And I think that goes back to Forrest's point that when we are thinking about what we're looking for and how we spend our money, like we're thinking about investing in children, we're thinking about investing in communities, we're thinking about investing in human development. And, oftentimes we'll get in these conversations with people, even people in the know, and they want to talk to us about roofs and boilers, which are real, but are never the driving concern when it comes to thinking about how you build a system. We have so much flexibility and leverage between, the big revenue streams and the district and the schools, and so much opportunity that comes from scale.
Great, thank you.
Next one, Michael.
Yeah. Another question from the chat, I think picking up on something you had mentioned in the presentation on special education. So the question is, how are special education funds allocated? Is it just according to the number of students in need plus the cost of their needs?
Yes, and it also depends on how students are allocated to schools and how some of those needs are staffed, and how some of those needs are assessed, and the extent of those needs are determined. And each and every one of those things plays a role in what the district thinks it needs, what the district can fund. This is, again, another area that we're really, really interested in getting into. And you saw Miriam's name up there on the list of folks. This is an area of work that she leads and has great insight into. But one of the first things that came out when I started following along with her work to think about how I could apply these budget principles there was learning that the special education budget is on a completely different cycle on the funding streams than the rest of this money. And so you're building a budget that's kind of being built like this, and yet there's a final number that's attached to a school building and to a school for a year. And that is really not great practice. So there are many, many opportunities to kind of continue to deliver higher quality, more equitable and better services, not just for everybody, but in particular for special education students. That some of this work, I think, could help people put a finger on versus just, again, that feeling of vibes and crisis that we often start with when we do this work.
Another question from the chat around I think where you got your data from. So Dan's asking if you could point to any maps or data sources showing like the number of K-12 kids for each community area or award, or whatever the statistics you used for some of the charts that you showed for us. And is there an easy way to get those segmented by race and or income levels?
Yeah, so all of the charts that I showed were generated through observable notebooks, which I think were those added to the notes section on YouTube Live there?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're interested in any of those graphs, then just check those out. The data sources are various. Like there's details, like all those notebooks also go into detail about what those sources are, but just a big overview is that the most of the data about the student body is coming from CPS itself. They annually release a demographic report, which is this big Excel sheet that cuts the data a bunch of different ways. It does not cut the data. It cuts the data by race. It cuts the data by I think SPED status, but it does not cut the data by income. That's not something that they have available. I mean, that they make available. I think it probably would be available, at least certain, because it is connected to some funding streams, but I'm not seeing that. Then the birth data ultimately comes in a roundabout way from the Illinois Department of Public Health. Has a Bureau of Vital Statistics. That's where that's coming from. It's originally collected by hospitals, because you have to, like when you have a live birth, then you have to fill out paperwork that gets submitted to the County Department of Public Health. We get submitted to the Illinois Department of Public Health, and then we get it back. And then there's some census data sprinkled in there as well. If you want details on any of that, just check out the observable notebooks.
And on my side, it's downloading the CPS budget book, and then enrollment numbers come from the district. They release them annually. That's that 20th day number that always sets all of those articles rolling.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think part of Dan's question too is not only like the data sources, but then kind of on the flip side, if there's been any sort of like visualization, particularly around maps, like taking that data and showing on a map of Chicago, any sort of decline in births and whatnot by race, income, and so forth, or is it always kind of source data and then graphs?
You can, so the Illinois Department of Public Health, the Chicago Department of Public Health has a very nice resource called the Chicago Health Atlas that Derek and I many years ago worked on for a while, although it's no longer a project we work on. And they cut the birth data by community area, I believe is the finest that you can get it. I didn't use it for this project because it wasn't relevant for a district-wide analysis, but that's the best. That's really the most fine-grained you're going to be able to get this data unless you can get a data sharing agreement with the Department of Public Health.
You're also seeing a lot of internal migration in the city, and both sort of like residential mobility, like pulling a lot of people up our northwest side, like where I am. My son's preschool has 3 preschool classes, which is, you know, been unheard of in this region for a long time, but there's a lot of kids and families moving to the neighborhood. And also, you know, my school is a great example of this. There are people from outside. We think about attendance boundaries and student allocation as something where like you go to the school closest to your house. And that's not always the case. And there is some capital planning documentation that folks have shared out that shows how many kids are coming from outside the attendance area. So that's another type of mobility that's happening. And concentrating folks. And that's my worry again with fiscal stuff, is that if more kids equals more money from district to school, then you are sort of putting yourself into like a very high pressure, quickly accelerating game of winners and losers, which is not really where we want to be with anything.
You want to pick up the next one? I think you kind of added on to the one I asked too.
Yeah, sure. All right, so yeah, another question from the chat here. As the amount of students have decreased, has operational costs also decreased with the decrease in enrollment? Or could you speak to the relationship between enrollment and operational costs?
So I think operational cost means we're looking at the expenditure data that's on the other side of the revenue. We're taking out debt, we're taking out capital, and we're talking about the size of the operating budget for the district. Or are we like, that has been increasing. But a large significant part of that is teacher salaries. There are other operational costs. There's a whole chunk of money that I call kind of programmatic and policy money. So that's initiatives. You know, there's other types of costs that have changed. So I would not say that that top line operational number that is increasing represents maybe anything intentional or anything that's being reflected in the way that our kids are being educated or anything that's being reflected in sort of how we staff. It's something that just kind of is.
I would also say like during this period, you had a substantial increase in pre-K as a strategy, which is like the reason why my graph is like K through 12 is because that's a change that happened during this period. So you can't really compare that population over this period because of CPS's strategy of successful strategy of dramatically increasing the pre-K. So that's like it's a whole slice of operations that didn't exist before. You know, we also during this period you have the expansion of charters, which increases an enormous amount of overhead. Like because you have redundant, I mean, you like in the period when you have enrollment declining, you're producing like you're opening up new school buildings and like which all have their own kind of overhead, which is not just capital. I mean, it goes into operations. So I think it's I think there's actually a very important question, like thought there that like needs to be run down, which is like, okay, like if we can kind of think of a narrow student like a narrow student sphere of operational costs, like you know like classroom instruction, you know, things that have like, you know, PE, things that are really like, okay, this is like clearly about like directly providing students. Has that declined? I think that's actually a key and critical question that would be good to track down.
And I think it's worrisome that we don't know.
What do you think, Michael? Do you think we have time for one more?
Yeah, you want to go ahead and do one more?
Yeah, and I think the question I was actually going to ask was about charter school expansion. So I think you kind of touched on that already. But there is one last question, which is, and you already talked about this a little bit, but you know, Joel asks, how will budgets work generally with the elected school board? Is there any like thought as to how that? I mean, you already mentioned it'll be a period of transition. But do you see it changing?
Nothing changes with the taxing authority. I mean, the risk that the district faces is a hostile mayor. You know, there's like a number of like, this was what Denali was talking about, and I'll let her kind of talk about it again, but the IGAs, you know.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, there's a lot of possibility. And then again, I think it's the excitement of an elected school board. The excitement exists to the extent which you get people on the school board who want to take the district in a direction of investing more in kids. And I think one thing that will be really important, and part of the reason that I do feel like it's really urgent for us to continue this work, is to be able to resource those people. And what you have now is with mayoral control is the mayor kind of seeing the school as an agency or a department or something that kind of produces and manages the city. An elected school board would sort of direct the schools in a way that would, like, the schools would hopefully serve children rather than serving the larger interests of the city and the tax base, because there is an incentive there for schools to be run as cheaply as possible, so more money is coming into the tax base, but not so cheaply that they're not drawing and keeping families. Those are not the best incentives for educating our children. With an elected school board, what I'd really like to see is folks who want to start the budgeting process with a vision of what a school should look like, or what a child's education should look like, or start to look at the state level figures about adequacy, or think about equity measures across the district, and use those kinds of first principles to build a robust and resilient budget that actually, gets the thing done. That's my hope. And that's why I want to resource an elected school board. That's why I want to get people excited about it. But that's also why I want to get people talking about this budget thing. Because the longer that we're talking about declining enrollment being the thing that's going to drive our budgeting and our revenue process, the less we're talking about other threats, but also like the less we're talking about, like Forrest said, these opportunities that present themselves.
awesome. Well, it seems like a great note to end on. So thank you again, Forrest and Denali. This has been a great presentation, really informative. And yeah, thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
What's next, Michael?
We will hop over to the post live stream Zoom. So hopefully, if it's not already up, we'll post in the YouTube chat the link for that post live stream Zoom. Will also be posted on Slack here as well. So we'll see you over there. And I guess we can end with our usual farewell. Are you ready, Derek?
I'm always ready.
Go forth.
And hack. Thanks, folks.